first thing we're going to talk about is inheritance of traits in sexually reproduced organisms, or the passing traits from parents to offspring, right? So let's start with humans. Now, we know that all humans have 46 chromosomes in the form of 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each individual gets one set of 23 chromosomes from mom and one set of 23 chromosomes from dad. Therefore, every chromosome has a pair that carries a similar yet different set of genetic information. A chromosome is a single strand of DNA that has hundreds or thousands of genes along that set. Each gene carries a code to create a protein that determines a trait of an organism. So we know that genes determine our traits, and it is the proteins that the genes code for that produce our traits. Each chromosome pair has 2 possible genes for every one of the organism's traits. You have 2 possibilities for every trait that you have. One from mom and one from dad. Half of the chromosomes come from dad and half from mom. In other words, for every trait, the organism physically shows the trait from either dad or mom, but has a version of the trait from both mom and dad within their genes. The genotype is the possible trait that can be expressed by an offspring, which is a combination of mom and dad's genes. The phenotype is what is actually expressed physically as a trait by the offspring. This is similar to flipping a coin to see which side you get. The genotype is the coin. It is the heads or tails. The phenotype is the result of the coin flip, the side you actually land on. Some traits that are inherited are stronger than others. For example, the trait for brown eyes is stronger than the trait for blue eyes. If you inherit the trait for brown eyes from one parent and blue eyes from the other parent, you're going to have brown eyes. Your phenotype will be brown eyes, but your genotype will be brown or blue eyes. The phenotype is physical traits. Pheno-physical. The genotype is the genetic possibilities. Genogenetic possibilities, right? So the genotype is what you could possibly get. The phenotype is what you actually display as your trait. Now, the only time an offspring will have a trait that is different from both mom and dad is when mutation occurs. If this mutation causes a beneficial phenotype, the organism will pass this trait on through the following generations, and it will eventually become an adaptation to the species. This is called natural selection. All right? So, natural selection results from mutations. That's because the only way you can vary something from what it was originally is to have a mutation, right? The only time an offspring can be different from mom or dad is when a mutation occurs. So, let's review a bit of this, right? We have our passing of traits from parents to offspring. Dad gives 23 chromosomes. Dad's in green. Mom gives 23 chromosomes. Mom's in red. Now, the 23 chromosomes from dad contain all the genes for all the traits, and the 23 chromosomes from mom contain all the genes for all the traits as well. Okay? So, let's look at the 23 genes. Now, I only had room to fit 14 of the 23, but let's pretend this goes all the way out to 23, right? We have a chromosome from dad, chromosome from mom. Dad, mom, dad, mom, dad, mom. Each of these chromosomes contains the same genetic information. in that it has genes for hair type, eye color, etc., right? So let's take chromosome number 1, stretch it out, chromosome number 1 for mom, stretch it out, and then on both we have a gene for the type of hair. Okay, we have dad gives you curly hair, mom gives you straight hair. This is your genotype, either curly or straight hair, your possible genetic information. Your phenotype is what you actually display, right? You have straight hair, that's your phenotype because you got that from mom. Mom's gene for straight hair was stronger than dad's gene for curly hair, so you display straight hair. All right? Hopefully this makes sense, and I'm going to start with mutations next. All right, so mutations. Mutations occur during DNA replication when a cell divides to make a new cell, right? So when you scratch your skin, you can see that there's dead skin. Those are dead skin cells falling off, and we know that our skin doesn't eventually run out, right? Which means we're replacing those skin cells with new cells. Well, that happens to all our cells. They divide and make new cells. So DNA replication is when we have new DNA put inside of the new cell. So DNA needs to make a copy of itself, replicate, and then divide into the new cell. There are 3 types of mutation that can occur during DNA replication. The 3 types are substitution, deletion, and insertion. Now, of course, as you go further into science, you will know that there are more types and varieties of those types, but for now we're just talking about the 3: substitution, deletion, and insertion. Mutations occur mostly randomly, but they can be caused by outside sources, like UV rays causing skin cancer, etc. Mutation results in a change of the nucleotide order of DNA, which is the nucleotides are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The change of the nucleotide order results in the creation of a different structure of a protein than the original DNA coded for. So, proteins determine our traits, and if the structure of the protein changes, then our trait changes. Therefore, mutations cause the change in the code, which causes a change in the proteins. Okay? So, we have mutations changes traits. Proteins determine your traits. The order of nucleotides determines your proteins, and mutation changes the order of nucleotides. Here we have an order of nucleotides before mutation. It was A, G, A, T, C, T. Let's say that produced curly hair. Okay? Now, after the mutation, we have A, T, C, T. Do you guys notice what mutation occurred? It was deletion. This G disappeared and is no longer there. So now our code is AATCT. Doesn't seem too different, but it is. It'll now make a new protein, and let's say the new protein is kinked hair. Okay? Mom had curly hair, dad had straight hair, child has kinked hair. That was the result of a mutation. Alright, so natural selection. Now, natural selection is the result of mutation. Okay? So variations of a trait are the result of mutations, right? So variations are exactly what I showed you here. Variations are something that are different from the parents. Okay? So a variation of a trait would be something that is not displayed by either mom or dad. Now, variations can be good, bad, or neutral. Okay? So, if a good variation helps an organism survive longer and reproduce more, that's a good thing, right? But if a variation makes it so it's harder to survive or reproduce less, that's a bad thing. And then if a variation doesn't result in a change of the ability to survive longer, then it's called neutral. Okay? So we're looking at good variations. The good variations slowly gain prominence. The new trait is passed on through generations because of its advantage. And they eventually become adaptations when all members of a species have this new trait. Now we can imagine this would take a long time, right? If one variation occurs in one organism, and that organism passes it on to its offspring, and then those offspring pass it on to the next offspring, and then those pass on to the next offspring, etc., etc. It'll take a long time for the species to all have that variation that helped it to survive, right? The famous example is the long neck of the giraffe. A short-necked giraffe cannot reach those upper leaves. It won't get the food that it needs to survive, so therefore the short-necked giraffe does not reproduce and survive long, whereas the long-necked giraffe does. Okay? So, the process where variations become adaptations is called natural selection. Okay? That's when nature determines which organisms survive through variations, through mutations. And that is natural selection. Now, what is artificial selection? Humans can influence certain traits or characteristics of organisms by selective breeding. We can choose the desired parental traits that are determined by the organism's genes, which are then passed on to the offspring. Selective breeding is also called artificial selection because instead of nature determining which traits are passed on through a species, it is humans that decide. Okay? Some examples include different breeds of dogs, different breeds of chickens, different breeds of pigs and cows that are larger for more meat, plants like corn and wheat that we've selectively bred to make them more delicious and more productive. Okay? So if we take mom with certain traits and dad with certain traits that we want to see in the offspring and we breed them, then we can slowly attempt to make a new version of the same species that has the traits that we as humans want. Alright, so with our knowledge of how genes determine traits, humans are now experimenting with genetic engineering. This is when DNA is changed using chemical and biological methods to alter how genes make organisms behave. So we, in effect, are causing mutations to DNA through genetic engineering. Plants can be modified to have more desirable traits that help us feed more people. In humans, genes can be replaced or inactivated in order to help cure diseases. Genetic engineering is relatively new, and people are still unsure if they trust genetically modified organisms. But the future will definitely be full of advancements in this field. The vaccines and cures for viruses and diseases will depend on the ability of scientists to use genetic engineering. Someday, genetic engineering could end hunger and suffering, which is both scary and exciting to think about. So genetic engineering, we alter the DNA of species or individual organisms in order to get characteristics or traits that we want to see. If an organism has the trait for a disease, we can alter that organism's DNA to change it from containing a disease to not containing a disease. We can see how this could be beneficial. If you have any questions, please email me or message me, and don't forget to complete the 15 questions that I have posted with this assignment, most of which can be answered either through the reading in your science book or the watching this video. Feel free to watch it multiple times and pause when needed.